ready or not? And we put together a very impressive panel to answer that very question. And coming to lead this group is one of the original members of the U.S. Army's Delta Force and a three-star general who's been involved in nearly every major American conflict during his 36-year Army career. Today, he serves as the Executive Vice President for the Family Research Council. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Lieutenant General Jerry Boykin and our panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right, we're already behind, so I got to make up a little time here. If I can get my panel out here. It's kind of hard maneuvering around the Secret Service here, so. Come on. Anybody know a joke? Hillary Clinton, yeah, okay. Well said, all right. Okay, we're gonna jump right into this in the interest of time here. We're gonna talk about military readiness. The title of our panel is the U.S. Military Ready or Not. We have three distinguished panelists today. First, we have Elaine Donnelly, starting on the other end there. Yeah. And this lady knows more about certain aspects of readiness in the military than anybody. She, in 1992, was the president of the President's Commission on what we say was Women in Combat. And she was also a member of the DACOWITS, and today she is the president of the Center for Military Readiness, and one of those people that knows an awful lot about military readiness. Next, we have Congressman Jim Bridenstine from Oklahoma. Yes, one of the most conservative members of Congress today and a true warrior in his own right. He is a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserve. He flew the E-2C Hawkeyes in Iraq and Afghanistan. He is now an FA-18 pilot, still in the Navy Reserve. In fact, I was out there a couple of weekends ago and missed him because he was doing his reserve duty. And then finally, we have Major General retired Gary Harrell, former commander of the Delta Force, commissioned in the infantry, served in the 82nd Airborne, then in Special Forces, and then he came to Delta while I was a young officer there myself. And a distinguished combat record. He commanded all the Special Forces and Special Operations Forces for the Central Command right after 9/11. He took them all into Afghanistan there. And he's a very dear personal friend of mine because we share something very unique in that we were both wounded at the same time. And he's a very special friend. So I want to jump right into it, and I'm going to ask Congressman Bridenstine to give us a short presentation on where we stand with military readiness. So, Congressman Bridenstine, please.
Well, thank you, General. Can everybody hear on this microphone? Awesome. Well, it's an honor to be here. I always appreciate speaking at the Value Voters Summit, and of course, a lot of us in Congress look to the Family Research Council for good advice and information when we make important decisions in Washington. So thank you to the FRC. Thank you, General Boykin, for having me on this panel. I want to make a point of something. One of the reasons I initially got involved in running for Congress is because I was a pilot in the United States Navy Reserve. Actually, I'm in the Oklahoma Air National Guard today. But at the time I got elected, I was a pilot in the Navy Reserve flying E-2 Hawkeyes, and I was doing counter-drug operations down in Central and South America. We would fly out of places like Curacao, El Salvador, Barranquilla, Colombia, and other places. My squadron, VAW 77, the Night Wolves, we were responsible for busting $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas. $2 billion. Every year. Well, there was a time when members of Congress decided that we needed to cut federal spending, which we all agree with. And what they said is we're going to put together a plan to cut discretionary spending. Actually, it was a plan to cut mandatory spending. When we think about federal spending, mandatory spending constitutes about 2/3 of federal spending. When I say mandatory, I'm talking about Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Obamacare, SNAP, the food stamp program, These are mandatory programs. What that means is that your members of Congress, we do not authorize and we do not approve those programs on an annual basis. We don't appropriate the money for those programs. If you qualify for the money, you get the money, and the only way those programs get modified, changed, reformed is if Congress intervenes and changes them. Well, Democrats want to spend more on those programs. And by doing nothing, those programs grow, and they have been growing very rapidly. Republicans are scared that if we touch those programs, somebody will make a commercial of Republicans throwing grandma off the cliff. So Republicans don't touch those programs either, even though they're growing very rapidly. So what we fight about in Congress is 1/3 of federal spending called discretionary spending. Half of that 1/3 is defense spending. And back in 2011, here's what they said in Congress. They said, we're going to come to an agreement on that 2/3 of federal spending that is mandatory. And if we don't come to an agreement, we're going to institute something called the sequester, which is an across-the-board cut of that discretionary side of the ledger, half of which is defense. This is a major problem that the Department of Defense has been going through now for a long time. My squadron, VAW 77, busted $2 billion worth of cocaine every year on the high seas, got eliminated, just like that. And that is one of many units across this country that got eliminated. And this limits the ability of our commanders and the folks that make decisions for our national security. It limits their opportunities to make good decisions because they don't have the resources available to them that they used to have available to them. So now you've got $2 billion worth of cocaine coming into the country. And even worse, you've got $2 billion worth of cash going to fund transnational criminal organizations down in Central and South America that are destabilizing countries in our own hemisphere. So when this happened to my squadron, I said, look, if you voted for this and you're a member of Congress, you guys probably remember they called it, it was the Budget Control Act. And if these folks, they created the super committee, 12 of them. None of them were from Oklahoma, but they had to come to an agreement to cut mandatory spending. And if they didn't, then it would trigger the sequester. And these 12 members of Congress got to make decisions to cut spending and increase taxes. There would be an up or down vote on the floor of the House, but there'd be no debates, no amendments, and no filibuster. And if it failed, it would decimate the Department of Defense. And the purpose of this was to be so painful that it would never happen, that Congress would have to come to an agreement. Well, Congress didn't come to an agreement. And so now the Department of Defense has been decimated. Our capabilities have been limited. And there's a whole host of programs and challenges that we've been working through since I've been here. Now, here's the challenge since I've been in Congress. What we've been doing year in and year out, have we been doing the 12 appropriation bills that constitute that 1/3 of federal spending that we authorize and appropriate every year? No. Have we been increasing spending for the Department of Defense? No. What we've been doing is we've been going to the end of the year every year, just like we are right now. We've got a government shutdown looming at the end of this month if we don't do something. And we roll all 12 appropriation bills into one massive package, and we fund next year exactly as we funded last year. And you either fund the whole government or the whole government shuts down. That's not the way this country has ever been run before this president, but that's the way it's being run now. Why? Because they don't want to see $1 more going to the Department of Defense unless you also increase spending for all the other federal programs. And oh, by the way, here's what they say when they do this. You're going to fund Planned Parenthood, or we're going to shut down the Department of Defense. That's why they roll all 12 of these appropriation bills into one massive package. That's why we pass appropriation bills in the House, they go to the Senate, and Harry Reid kills them all. He kills all of them. Why? Because he wants to make sure that if we don't fund Planned Parenthood, or the Syrian Refugee Resettlement Program, or all the EPA rules and regulations, or the president's illegal executive order for amnesty, the Constitution says Congress has the authority to create an uniform rule of naturalization. If you don't fund all those things, they've got this trump card called the Department of Defense, and the whole discretionary side of the ledger will shut down unless you fund those programs. Unfortunately, you've got a Congress that is unwilling to fight and instead does these continuing resolutions that have been hurting the Department of Defense. With that, I'll yield and listen to my other panel members.
Thank you very
Looking
much.
forward to questions.
Okay, Elaine?
Thank you, General. I am so excited to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm going to pick up where the Congressman left off. Is our military ready or not? This is a hot topic. Perhaps some of you remember earlier this year, Fox News carried a program on this very topic, and it talked about shortages and equipment failures, aircraft falling out of the sky, and a lot of people asked, why is this happening? Resources have been taken away. But this program also broke new ground, because you remember the image of ROTC cadets marching in red high heels? Why did that happen? What is going on with our military? That was training to deal with sexual assault in the armed forces. It shocked a lot of people, and I'm going to give you a few reasons to understand why this is happening. Back in 1992, I was a member of a presidential commission. We studied the issue of women in combat for a full year, and the first thing we decided was, how are we going to decide? On the issue of women in combat, we had a very simple principle, a resolution we voted on. Equal opportunity is important, but if there is a conflict between equal opportunity and the needs of the military come first. You have no idea how controversial that was. We had a huge battle. It was not a slam dunk commission, because there were several members who said, no, EO should come first, and they were all in favor of women in land combat, even back in 1992. Fast forward to the present. The Military Leadership Diversity Commission issued a report, you see a picture of it there, in 2011. This commission turned military values upside down. The result of that report is political correctness now is the standard of review. Military readiness is important, says the Obama administration, but if there is a conflict, political correctness comes first. The new definition of diversity is about group demographics. It is not about individual rights. It is not recognition of merit. It's about group rights. And the Pentagon really believes this stuff. There's been a lot of talk about generals and admirals lately. Mr. Trump made some news when he said that the officer corps, the senior leadership in uniform, he doesn't have confidence in their advice at this time. And you know why? He's right. Because Admiral Mike Mullen, seated there at the left, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was the prime mover behind what we now call LGBT law in the military. He said diversity is a strategic imperative for the security of our nation. To his right, Army Chief of Staff General George Casey Jr. a few years ago said, when there was the attack on Fort Hood, Nidal Hassan, he was a jihadist. They knew he was a jihadist. But Walter Reed sent him down to Fort Hood. And you know what George Casey said? Well, this is a tragedy, but I hope it doesn't hurt our efforts on diversity. Diversity is being extended into the combat arms. So when the order was given, the military salutes and they say, how high should we jump? Well, the Marine Corps started doing research studies. You see there on the right a very courageous female officer. Give her a lot of credit for trying. She was not able to get over that wall or succeed on the infantry officer course. There were proxy tests done. 20 or 30% of women could not do the heavy lifting. Only 1% of the men could not do these tests. There were higher fatigue levels. Higher fatigue creates more injury rates. 2 to 10 times as often women get injured. There were field tests, 9 months of field tests. They had all male units and they had mixed gender units. The all male units outperformed 69% of the time. And that's why when the Secretary of Defense said, well, we're going to ignore all that. We're going to have women in direct ground combat anyway. People said, wait a minute, why did this happen? Well, it's because diversity is the primary thing. And I want to define what combat is and what we mean. Direct ground combat means attacking the enemy. It means infantry, special operation forces, armor, artillery, and the like. Women have served in danger. They have served in harm's way, but they have not been in the units that attack the enemy direct ground combat. Well, the Marine Corps asked for exceptions. This is General Joe Dunford. I would exempt him from the generals that Mr. Trump criticized. He and the Marine Corps said, well, our standard says survivability and lethality in battle would be harmed with gender integration. But General Dunford was overruled. The Secretary of Defense said, no, their paramount concern is gender diversity. So the experiment is in progress. And you know what this means? If you have a son or a nephew or someone you care about in the military, and that person needs to be evacuated from the battlefield, will this female soldier who is being carried off on a training field right here in this picture, will that female soldier be able to rescue that young man from the battlefield? Well, it seems like the military says, no, that's not our primary concern. Take a look at these female soldiers. They're in infantry training. Look at the backpacks they have, very heavy. Do you see the unnatural curvature or leaning forward of their spine? These women are very injury prone now. 2 to 10 times more likely that they will suffer injuries. 6 of 7 female Marines were not able to get through their infantry training. They didn't have the strength, the stamina, the running speed. And yet, the military keeps denying quotas, and they say, but we want 25% women in the infantry, in the Marine Corps. How is that going to work? Well, you're either going to break a lot of female bodies, or you're going to have to lower the standards. The last thing we need are more female veterans who are disabled. That is not fair to women. It's not fair to men either. We don't do this in the Olympics. We have wonderful female gymnasts, but they don't do what the men do. Look at the man there with sheer muscle power, making a T shape from his own body. That upper body strength is something, a quality that men have. Most men do. Women do not. Well, I take that back. Not all men can do what the gymnasts do. But certainly, the androgen hormone difference matters when we're talking about physical strength. And the female gymnasts, of course, they do wonderful things. But the men, they're amazing too. But who gets all the money? Well, the female gymnasts do. But we're talking about warfare. We're talking about battle. We're talking about lives being at risk. Now comes the result of the experiment. Co-ed conscription. Are you ready for this? If you haven't heard, there is a defense bill right now in the Senate that would draft, include in registration for selective service, young civilian women who don't even know this is going on. I'm telling you, parents, this is the week right now. You better tell the Senate to take this out. Guess who put it in there? Senator John McCain. Put this provision in the defense bill. Get on your Twitter feed right now. It's called #Don'tDraftOurDaughters. Send messages to every member of the Senate right now. It's critically important. Selective service is only an insurance policy. If in a national emergency, we need to bring into the military people who are prepared or can be trained, we don't need to have thousands of people who are not physically prepared to become what are called combat replacements. You don't draft women for desk jobs, the Marine Band. It's only for combat replacements, the infantry. That's the largest branch in the service. We don't need to include our daughters in selective service. But again, taking gender diversity to extremes, this is a poster from the Pentagon. Did you know about lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender Pride Month? They've had 8 of them at the Pentagon and the White House, and it's become like a special interest faction. All of the promises that were made saying, well, don't worry, there won't be any threats to religious liberty. Well, that wasn't true. Religious liberty is under siege all the time. There was a promise made, no same-sex marriage or benefits if the law was repealed. That, of course, was implemented very quickly. There have been steep increases in sexual assault cases, both male and female. And the new LGBT equal opportunity standard means special rights status. Now we're headed straight for transgenders in the military, a promise that was made and denied at the time, but now here we are with a pink flag as well as the flag that we're more used to. The big problem here is doctors and nurses. If you have a doctor or nurse in the military, if you have a daughter or son at the academies, the military academies, if you're a military family and you have children in schools, guess what? The doctors and nurses will not be free to to avoid having to do this kind of treatment, including surgery, no conscience clauses. Personal privacy rights are secondary. And in the schools, this is the largest school system and child care center in the world. We're going to have transgender instruction at all levels of the Pentagon. That is the logical conclusion to diversity being the primary standard of review. If you saw the movie 13 Hours, you saw warriors. I want to pull this together. Why does this matter? It's the only military we have, folks. And when you see warriors, even in the civilian status, going to fight, and you see a station commander in the movie, his name was Bob, putting political correctness above a military objective, this shows you how political correctness that weakens military culture threatens lives. We are headed for what I call the Jenga block military. If you keep taking blocks out of the bottom of the tower and you keep loading them on top, guess what? You get a shaky tower and eventually it falls. Our national security is at risk and the military is under threat. Can the military strength be restored? Yes, it can. Here's some good news. The Republican National Platform calls for new priorities, an end to social experimentation and political correctness. It calls for an objective review of social policies and appropriate administrative, legal, or legislative action to correct problems, support for women's exemption from direct ground combat, support for their exemption from selective service, support for high uncompromised standards and religious liberty, due process rights in matters of sexual assault and misconduct. National security depends on sound values and priorities in our military. And here's the last slide. It's up to us, folks. If you support the military, they have to know that you have their back. People keep talking about we may lose the Supreme Court in the next election. I'm worried about losing our military. We have to choose carefully, and I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but civilian control of the military means we have to choose our leaders carefully. We have the responsibility to fight for the fighters who keep our nation safe. And that means we have to restore sound priorities in the only military we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Major General Harrell.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here today to address you. I sometimes wonder if some of our politicians have forgotten what our military is for. And this may sound crude to some of you, but the purpose of the military is to kill people and break things in the defense of our nation, in the defense of you and me. It is not to conduct social experimentation. One of my favorite quotes is from Orwell. It says, "We sleep peacefully in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to do violence in our behalf." And I was very fortunate in the military. I got to work with a bunch of those guys and even commanded them. And there is two things that kind of sets them apart. If you went to some of our most classified units and looked around on the wall, one of the first things you're going to see is a Bible verse that was quoted earlier, Isaiah 6:8. And the Lord said, "Whom shall I send and who shall go for me? And I said, Here am I, send me." There's a lot of people in our nation that have answered, and continue to answer that call. The other thing is, if you were to be privileged enough to be in the ranks before a mission was launched, where it's highly likely that everybody will not come back, the last thing we do is sing "God Bless America" before we get on the helicopter. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the mindset of the people that carry out some of the most dangerous missions that our military conducts. As a matter of fact, I still remember the night that we sang "God Bless America" before we launched on Black Hawk Down. And it was a very solemn occasion. even if then Colonel Boykin did lead us in the song. Sorry, I couldn't resist that, Jerry. But we launched that night after we sang that mission, and all of us didn't come home the next day. You know, I was also fortunate enough to be selected to go to work for Tommy Franks during the Iraq War. And Franks is a great leader. He had a wonderful plan, and he's often been criticized because he didn't have a contingency plan. You know what? He did not have a contingency plan. We had 8 contingency plans. And guess what? None of them worked. You know why? The enemy gets another side of the story. They get to vote in what you do. And a lot of people don't understand that. And for those of you that might think there was no WMD in Iraq, I would suggest that you go home and look up sarin gas, among other things. We found artillery shells uploaded with sarin gas, one of the most potent nerve agents that's been invented, and it was in Iraq. We found evidence of experimentation with chemical weapons that were in Iraq. We found rockets that exceeded the UN mandates there. So I'm a little bit skeptical, and I'm not telling you things that I read in reports. I'm telling you about things I saw and things that my people reported to me, those under my command. During the war, our mission was to keep the Iraqi forces up north while the U.S. forces came in from the south. And just to talk about how important teamwork is, I received a morning update, and my intel officer was talking about the fact that one of the Iraqi divisions that we were tasked to keep in place was getting ready to move south and get into the fight. I said, Tom, tell ODA X number to move over there and stop the division. My intel officer looked at me and he said, sir, you know an ODA is 12 men. I said, yeah, Tom, I know that. He said, you know an Iraqi division is thousands of people. I said, yes, Tom, I know that. Tom's a smart intel officer. I'm not picking on him. However, Tom, when you got the USS Abraham Lincoln in all the air wing in direct support, those 12 guys can stop a division. And you know what? That division did not move south. But I will also tell you that these rough men, to use Orwell's terms, do a lot of hard work, and they live life on the edge. And if the force gets too small, none of them would say this to you. If you ask them, were they having multiple deployments, more than anybody ever counted on because the force is too small, they wouldn't say anything. They'd tell you, no, we're fine. I know how those guys think. However, I'm telling you, they are rode hard and put up wet. And they are they are stretched very, very thin. That's why our military, shrinking our military, is extremely dangerous. We don't want to find out that our social experimentation failed in the field when our forces are surrendering. And oh, by the way, the Navy found that out the hard way. If you saw that lieutenant who was apologizing when he was captured and his guys were captured, and he said, oh, we were treated wonderfully. Yeah, I don't think so. Anyway, when you do dangerous work and you're spread too thin, it plays with your mind. It is a very dangerous situation to put our people in. They don't think that way, and and please don't take my comments as negative towards the troops in the field. I have nothing but the utmost respect for them. They are superb and simply outstanding, but we can't run them into the ground. And we can't overuse special operations forces because we work best as a team, just like my illustration of the ODA stopping the Iraqi division. That was teamwork. That was the epitome of teamwork. We got great support from the Navy. And even though I'll kid my Navy colleagues, I wouldn't want to go to war without them or without the Air Force. Again, I worry about the force getting too small and not trained to the same level that they used to be because they're spending too much time on some of these, I'll be kind and say social experiments. Thank you very much.
Okay. Douglas MacArthur stood in the West Point Mess Hall in 1963. If you go to West Point, you can still stand up in the very perch where he spoke to the assembled cadets there. And he said something very important. He said, "Your mission remains fixed, determined, inviolable, and it is to fight and win the nation's wars." This administration seems to have forgotten that. They don't seem to understand that the mission of our military is a single-purpose mission: fight and win the nation's wars. When we deploy our military into Africa to handle an Ebola outbreak, we are misusing our military. They did not sign up for that. They will go where they're told to go. They'll follow the orders of the commander-in-chief, but it is not their mission. And it is an abuse of power, in my view, to put them into that situation. Our next commander-in-chief has to get back to a realization and an understanding that our military has a single mission. It needs to stick to that. Now, is my video loaded? Okay. I was going to show you a video, and Gary Harrell just mentioned it. And I'm sorry that it won't load, because I can show you two videos that will tell you more about the seriousness of the readiness situation in our military. In 1965,
It's up.
it's up?
It's up.
Okay, in 1965, Jeremiah Denton was shot down. He's a Naval Academy graduate, shot down in Vietnam, and in 1966, after 10 months of torture, they forced him to make a statement on camera. That is prohibited by the Geneva Convention. But the rule is, when you reach the breaking point, go ahead and do what you have to do to stay alive. And he went on camera, but while he was on camera, he said, "I don't know my government's policies, but I still support it." But he did something else. This is 1966. I want you to watch this first video here. It's very short.
Former Alabama senator and prisoner of war Jeremiah Denton has died. Denton is probably best known as the POW who let his eyes do the talking during a 1966 interview from North Vietnam, where he was held for 7.5 years. Unbeknownst to his captors, Denton blinked the word torture in Morse code, alerting the U.S. government to conditions in the communist North.
Okay, did you catch that? I assume it was showing on the screen. I can't see it. Did it show on the screen? He got on there and blinked torture. His wife said, "What's the matter with his eyes?" And the intel community said he's blinking torture. That's when we knew that the Vietnam POWs were being tortured. 10 months of torture. 10 months of torture before he made that. Now let's go to January of 2016. A 2011 Naval Academy graduate, same place that Admiral Denton went. 2011 Naval Academy graduate. Show the video.
It was a mistake. That was our fault, and we apologize for our mistake.
Okay, show the next video.
The Iranian behavior was fantastic while we were here. We thank you very much for your hospitality and your assistance.
Does that tell you anything about the readiness of our military to fight and win wars? It says more than I can tell you with all the statistics I could give you. Do you think that our enemy fears us? Do you think that our allies trust us? What happened to our military? And I'll tell you what happened to us, the things that these people talked about here today. We cut the budgets, we reduced the force structure, and we started all these social experiments, and all we've done is contributed to the demise of our military, and I'm very worried about the future of it. Congressman Bridenstine, could you quickly tell us what's the truth about the situation with aviation and the Air Force and the Navy? We see a lot about cannibalization, and what's the truth?
Sure. So I'm on the Armed Services Committee, so we get a lot of testimony about this kind of thing. A lot of people in this room might be familiar that our B-52s on average are 55 years old. Is there anybody in this room by chance who flew B-52s or worked on B-52s? If you would raise your hand. Thank you. So that's your father. So 55 years old is the average age of the B-52 fleet. That means half of them are older than that on average. And when you think about the fact that your United States Air Force is planning to keep these planes flying well into the 2040s, we're talking about planes, some of them will be 100 years old. That's what we're dealing with now. Now, I'll tell you a story. I know we're at the Value Voters Summit, and a lot of us believe in the resurrection. There was a B-52 not too long ago that was at the Davis-Monthan Boneyard. A lot of military folks in the room are probably familiar with this boneyard. That's where airplanes go when they're too old to fly or they're too broken to fly. Well, it came to the point where our United States Air Force had to go into the boneyard and grab a B-52 that had been there for 8 years rotting in the desert, pull it out, rehab it, and now it is in the service of the United States Air Force. That's where we are. That's one example. Another example, down not too long ago, the United States Marine Corps took an F-18 Hornet, needed a spare part, and we didn't have the spare parts. So they went to a museum, the USS Yorktown, and they took a spare part for an F-18 off of a museum display, and that part was integrated into the workable F-18. By the way, that F-18 that received that part flew in the raid on Gaddafi in 1986. That's your Marine Corps F-18 fleet. So when you think about the Air Force, we in this country used to have 134 fighter squadrons, 134. Your Air Force today has 55. The generational leaps in technology do not make up for the fact that we have cut our capabilities by that much. I told the story earlier about my own squadron that got eliminated. So these are just some examples. There are many others. Like you said, we can talk about statistics all day, and I've just been going over a list of them here that I printed out before I came over. But the challenge today is very, very real. We're operating with a military when there are more threats than we have ever seen in the history of this country proliferating all over the world. We're operating with a military that is not where it needs to be. And quite frankly, as I mentioned earlier, I blame our politicians who couldn't come to an agreement back in 2011. They created this super committee. The super committee failed, and it triggered the defense sequester. Our United States military is still dealing with that in ways that I don't think our United States Congress ever intended back in 2011. That's one of the reasons I'm a Republican. I ran against an incumbent Republican in a Republican primary, not believing that I could ever win the race, but because it was the right thing to do because that was a terrible vote. And because I surprised myself and a lot of others when we actually won. Running on a platform that said, we need to make sure that our Department of Defense is well trained, manned, and equipped to fight our country's battles. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you. Elaine, a question for you. The social experiments are one of the reasons that this video is so powerful, because that crew and its commander never got code of conduct training. They spent their time in a classroom on diversity, equal opportunity, sexual harassment, white privilege, and a variety of other things that contribute nothing to war fighting. Can the president reverse that by executive order, or is this going to take an act of Congress to reverse those kinds of things, or do you know?
It's going to take a combination of things. When Ronald Reagan ran for president, Jimmy Carter had what was called a hollow military. It had the same shortages as we're seeing now, and the congressman has explained so very well. However, when Reagan came in, his job was easy. All he had to do was build some more ships and planes, and he talked about missile defense, he didn't have to worry about the basic culture of the military. The next president's going to have to deal with the culture, how things are done, what is taught, what is considered important. All these years, 8 years of diversity training instead of readiness training, this is the kind of thing that the next president will have to deal with. And I have to tell you, I have talked with the Trump campaign. All of the elements in the Republican platform that I mentioned had to have a green light before they went in, and the delegates voted for them. So I was very reassured by that. So when Mr. Trump said yesterday, well, the generals, they're in a shambles right now, I forget his exact words, I knew exactly what he meant. What we need to have, and I think it is his intent, is to give new orders. Because it isn't the fault of the brass, the people in the uniform, some of them I do blame, but they have to follow orders. So under new orders, just like the platform says, a combination of things, legislative, executive order, or judicial, arguing things in court, like, for instance, defending the exemption of women from selective service. Of course, the next president can make all the difference. And that leadership will be felt in Congress, too. So I'm very encouraged by that. We've got an election ahead, but I can tell you this, if Hillary Clinton wins, everything bad we're seeing will get worse. Their platform is all about diversity. That's their primary objective.
Okay, thank you. And Gary, I'm going to finish up with a quick comment from you. I'd like your assessment on what the overuse of the Special Operations Forces, what's the long-term impact on that?
Well, the long-term impact is once you get so low, you can't just snap your fingers overnight and build it back up. It takes years to bring a typical soldier into the Special Operations Forces, as you know. And so that time that it takes to build everything up, you won't have them available to do missions. And then that goes back into the comment about, you know, they're stretched very, very thin. And when you're stretched very, very thin, you might make a mistake. If not, you know, it's a terrible burden that your family, your wife, your children has to bear because you've gone on multiple deployments. And if you're doing a very dangerous mission time and time and time again, even though you're highly trained, the best person to do it, sooner or later you're going to start thinking, wonder when the odds are going to catch up with me, and the guy that I'm going in on, you know, he beats me to the draw.
Thank you, Gary, and give our panel a hand. Thank you very much for your attention.